Let's move on to our first guest segment. We have here in studio with us for the first time, Mr. Ivan Pentchoukov. He's Deputy Chief Editor for Digital at Epoch Times. Epoch Times is an independent global news and entertainment company headquartered here in New York City with the motto of truth and tradition. Joining Ivan on Skype is Elizabeth Slattery. She's the legal fellow for Heritage Foundation and the host of SCOTUS 101 podcast. Hi, you there, Julie?
Thanks for having me.
By the way, that's a great, Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Julie's
I'm right
Elizabeth.
here. I promise, I'm here.
Great. I love the podcast name.
Thanks.
So, Elizabeth, this week was a big week with the Senate hearings for President Trump's Supreme Court pick, Brett Kavanaugh. How do you think it's going?
Well, the Democrats have done their best to try to make it a circus, but I think Judge Kavanaugh has come across as a great judge and a great man, and I think the Senate will confirm him in the next couple of weeks.
What's your take?
Yeah, I agree with Elizabeth. I think despite the antics from the Democrats, how the judge has come across has been very confident. He's sort of an intellectual powerhouse, and he was very patient with the folks that tried to press him on certain things. And, in general, he sailed through these hearings, and the confirmation is now more or less inevitable. Even the New York Times is basically saying there's no chance something can happen.
Well, it's inevitable because there's more Republicans than Democrats, but don't you think he got tripped up a little bit on some of the inconsistencies from the Bush emails and the fact that he had said one thing about Roe at his hearings and said something very different in emails that he had sent when he worked at the White House? I mean, I don't know if he's sailing through them. I think he's frankly, I think he's tripping through them. I agree he's going to get confirmed, but I'm not so sure that he's doing the fine job that people think that he's doing.
Yeah, well, that was my feeling too. When Kamala Harris pressed him, when Cory Booker pressed him, it looked as though he was backing up and sort of like the flow was broken up, where he wasn't talking all the time. But I think this is actually a strategy because, like Kamala Harris is a seasoned prosecutor, so she has a tempo where she'll sort of try to beat you down with questions. And what he did instead is he built in these silences which sort of killed this prosecutorial tempo, where she could press him, interrupt him with further questions. So I think it seemed really uncomfortable, but I think this is actually a strategy of his because he knew this, she was bringing out a question out of the dark. She wouldn't tell him who worked at this company, Kasowitz, like when she put this thing up. So I think he was actually being really, really smart with these things. He was prepared for these questions, and he built in these silences where she was just basically, in the end, forced to back away.
Elizabeth, do you think that just listening to this dialogue, I find it interesting that the hearings are basically almost like an inkblot test? You see what you want to see because it's like we have two different realities here where it's, he was flawless, nothing on him. And then Julie's like, no. I mean, do you think it's sort of one of those inkblot tests?
I think it is, and I think the Democratic base is probably really pleased with the way that Cory Booker and Kamala Harris made this, their debut for the 2020 presidential election. But I think Kavanaugh did a great job. And on the point of the emails about Roe v. Wade, he didn't say anything that was inconsistent in the emails. He simply pointed out that there are some legal scholars that question its validity, and he wasn't making any comment about his views. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind about any of the emails from his service in the Bush administration was that he was acting as an attorney to the president, which is very different from the job he's interviewing for, which is to be a fair, independent, and impartial judge on the Supreme Court, which he's been a great judge on the appeals court, and I think he will make an excellent justice on the Supreme Court.
The one thing I will say before, I know we have to go, but the one thing I'll say is, to me, the more troubling thing was the Kasowitz thing that you brought up. Because he was asked whether he spoke to anybody from the president's legal team about what was going on with the president. And he said, who do you have in mind? I've never spoken to anybody from the president's legal team. I don't know, Carrie, if you have. I mean, the answer is no, I haven't. And if he say, what do you have in mind, or whom do you have in mind, that says to me that actually there was some sort of conversation going on. And that's where I go back to the fact that he is going to essentially be a juror in the question of whether a sitting president can get indicted while he's already in conversations with the president's own lawyer. That, to me, is a complete disqualifier for no other reason. It's not that I don't think Republicans deserve a seat on the court. They have the Senate. They have the White House. It's who that Republican is, and that to me just smells.
James Mitchell, one of our viewers, says he was silent because he didn't want to hang himself.
There you go.
But Julie, here's my thing on what you just said. As far as I don't know where everyone works when I speak with them necessarily. I guess you'd have to have a pretty in-depth knowledge of someone, or if you're in a meeting, if it's a group setting. I mean, similar to the charge that Jeff Sessions was colluding with Russians because he was at a reception where there happened to be a Russian ambassador. This seems like a kangaroo court where we're trying to impugn someone just because they might have. I mean, D.C. has a lot of lawyers crawling around, as Karl Rove has pointed out. Do you know where everyone that you've ever spoken to works at?
I know where everybody, if I were a judge.
Every single person.
I know where, if I were a judge and somebody were working for the defense team for the president, I would know whom they were working for.
By the way, he later answered no to that question.
He what? The next day. But why not answer?
He probably looked at the roster because he doesn't want to be trapped into perjury, because you don't know where everyone works, right? So he asked for a list of people. Right. He probably went back and looked at everybody who works there.
I lived in D.C. for a while. Let me tell you, it is a small town, and everybody knows where everybody works, because that's your job to know, especially if you are a sitting federal judge. So just for the record.
Elizabeth, what's your take on that line of questioning as far as where someone works? I mean, you're there in the swamp. No offense, but
It is very swampy this week. It's 99 degrees. No, I think Judge Kavanaugh was trying to be very careful in ensuring that he didn't say, no, I've never spoken to anyone from that law firm. You know, as you pointed out, there are hundreds of people that work at the firm, and he might not necessarily know everyone that works there. You know, the next day he came back and said, well, I know former Senator Joe Lieberman. He's of counsel there. I don't think I've talked with him about this. But, you know, he did acknowledge that, of course, he has discussed things in the news with his fellow colleagues at the D.C. Circuit, and I'm sure with other people. But I think what it comes down to is that Senator Harris was trying to suggest there was some sort of improper discussion that Judge Kavanaugh had, but she has no proof of that, and she was just trying to tar him up and make him look bad without any actual evidence.
I think she's a former prosecutor, and I think prosecutors never ask questions they don't have the answers to, so I'm not so sure about that. But
then why didn't she say who it was?
Yeah, she never followed up with anything.
Should.
So maybe she's going to drop a bombshell, but
maybe she will.
I would be really surprised if someone who is in consideration for the Supreme Court had such a conversation. You know, Brett Kavanaugh is a smart guy, and, you know, he has been, throughout his career as a judge, he's maintained his independence and his impartiality. Those are the most important things to him as a judge, and I don't think he would have done anything that would put those in jeopardy.
Ivan, can you talk a little bit about the Ginsburg rule? Because actually, if you look at Rob Bluey's Twitter, he's a colleague of Elizabeth at the Heritage Foundation. He has a video, which is a mashup of all these judges or the history of the Ginsburg rule. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's called the Ginsburg rule, but actually all the Supreme Court nominees, do more or less the same thing, where they refuse to answer hypothetical questions about a possible matter that might come before them. And the reason they do that is because it's impossible to decide a case without the specifics of that case before you. So when someone asks about, what if this matter comes before you, what if a hypothetical case comes before you, cases like these come with dozens, if not hundreds, of pages of details, and the judge has to use those details to judge the case. So hypothetical questions, they call it the Ginsburg rule, but as Judge Kavanaugh said, he studied the past 8 or 9 nominees, their confirmation hearings, and they all do this. And he laid it out during the first day of questioning that, I think he was given the opportunity to do that by a Republican senator, that he's going to follow the same rule.
It's a smart rule to follow, but what's interesting is that Mitch McConnell actually had warned the White House against nominating Kavanaugh for this particular reason, that his trail was way too long. There were too many pages, there were too many documents, that the Ginsburg rule may apply, but there's a vast trove of information back there that they could point to, and that's exactly what Democrats have done. Again, I agree, he's going to get confirmed, he's going to be on the court, but I think the administration has kind of needlessly put itself, and the Senate has needlessly put itself through a bloodbath that they probably would not have had to do with somebody who was a little bit less of a record keeper, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think when you look at the other possible nominees, Elizabeth, I'd love to get your take on this. The other names that are under consideration, I thought Kavanaugh seemed to be the more moderate of the choice as far as his decisions, his worldview. What's your take, Elizabeth?
Well, Kavanaugh was definitely the most experienced as a judge of all of the nominees that were sort of the front runners. And I think it's important to select judges who have a record, so you know what kind of judge they are, what kind of justice they'll be, how they approach the law. And I think that that's exactly what we got with Judge Kavanaugh. We know that he's a textualist, and we know that he's going to be faithful to the Constitution.
You have a lot more hope in him than I do, but I look forward to seeing him on the court for the next 50 years, which is about how long he's going to be there.
Well, and you know what I found interesting is I heard, Democrats saying, oh, this is like stealing the seat because it was Kennedy and he was the swing vote. But who nominated Kennedy? Oh, yeah, Ronald Reagan. So we were the ones, conservatives were the ones who were disappointed by Kennedy not being conservative on the court.
This is stealing a seat because Merrick Garland, who actually is on the same court as Judge Kavanaugh, should have had that seat. And if we're going to be talking about not bringing anybody up before an election, then I guess there's an election coming up in about 60 days that maybe we shouldn't discuss until we see who controls the Senate. By Republican standards, I think that's actually ridiculous. I think that Judge Kavanaugh should have gotten a hearing and has gotten a hearing. I think Merrick Garland should have gotten a hearing because Barack Obama was still president until the day he wasn't. So that's what they're talking about. They're talking about stealing a seat.
Julie, Clay Aiken's not here right now because he would roll my eyes for bringing up Barack Obama, so I'm glad you did. But to quote him, he said, elections have consequences.
Exactly.
That includes Senate elections, which means the Senate decides the calendar of whether to interview Merrick Garland or not. So that's it. It's not about a stolen seat. And so that's what I find. It's actually unconstitutional for you to claim that the Senate should not fulfill its constitutional right to manage the calendar.
But the president actually nominates, and the president back at the time, now that we want to go back to Barack Obama, was in fact Barack Obama. So it's not like the Senate could just
but with the advice and consent of
with the
Senate.
Advice and consent, but the Senate
did not give consent.
The Senate did not advise or consent. The Senate just ignored it and said we're going to outweigh Barack Obama. I'm saying if that's the standard, why don't we just outweigh Mitch McConnell? Let's see who controls the Senate in a few months. I mean, that's where it's ridiculous because I think all of us agree that the president gets to nominate and the Senate gets to advise and consent. And that's the way it should always be. And that's the way it's happening now. And that's the way it really should have happened back in 2008. Or not 2008, excuse me. I forget what election is this we're talking about?
I think you have something to say,
sorry.
No, I think it's funny in Kavanaugh's case because his own confirmation was held back by 3 years when he was first nominated to the circuit court. So it's not like this isn't a politicized process. Both sides have done this before. And with Kavanaugh, I think, part of the big plus for Kavanaugh is his nomination has been delayed. So I think this is just politics playing out. It wasn't like this was only done once with Merrick Garland.
He's finally getting his due. So Elizabeth, down there in the swamp, walk us through the timeline. What do you think? Your crystal ball. What's going to happen? Timeline.
So the committee will meet for an executive session next Thursday, and they'll consider whether they're going to report Kavanaugh out of committee. It's pretty standard for the minority party on the committee to ask for an additional week. So I think within the next 2 weeks, Kavanaugh will likely be reported out of the committee to the full Senate, and then soon after, I expect Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will bring him up for a confirmation vote.
Okay. And Elizabeth, what was the deal, real quick before we go, about that crazy conspiracy theory on the internet about Zena Bash?
Oh, gosh. So Zena Bash is, she's a White House official. She clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, and she was sitting behind him. She was on the team that helped shepherd him through the process. And I guess the way she was holding her arms, I mean, she was sitting in these seats for, 13 plus hours a day. And there was this theory on the internet that she was making some sort of white power symbol, but it's just ridiculous. I don't think she realized what she was doing at the time. And, it really shows that the left is grasping at straws to try to criticize, anyone in this process.
Well, especially because her mother is, this is what her husband said, her mother's Mexican and her father's Jewish. So,
yeah, I got to say, let's not put the left in all of this together. Because when I saw that, I thought that was the most ridiculous conspiracy I'd ever seen. I mean, but this is not an unusual thing to do. I didn't even know what a white power sign was until I heard about this controversy. But anyway, I think it's absolutely absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. And if that's all they've got on Kavanaugh, I think he's in good shape.
Yeah, they got a lot more,
Yeah.
but he's still in good shape.
All right. Thanks, Elizabeth Slattery, for joining us from Heritage Foundation, and Ivan from Epoch Times. Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks for having me.